A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Have you ever noticed how some sounds just bypass your ears and go straight to your nervous system, like the sound of a fluorescent light tube shattering? It is not just a noise. It is a high-pitched crystalline explosion that carries this weird hollow weight to it. And when you see that happen over someone's head or across their bare chest, your brain does this immediate double take. It is trying to reconcile the fact that you are watching entertainment with the biological reality that glass is not supposed to do that to a human being. It is a sensory overload that signals danger on a primal level, yet here we are in the year 26, and this subculture is more visible than ever thanks to the way these clips go viral on social media.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I know exactly what you mean, Corn. It is that visceral rejection of what we are seeing. Our housemate Daniel sent us a prompt this week that really forced me to look into a corner of the world I usually avoid. He has been watching documentaries on deathmatch wrestling. For anyone who has managed to avoid this subgenre, we are not talking about the bright lights and choreographed acrobatics of the big wrestling promotions you see on television. This is the underground, the independent circuits where the ring is often wrapped in barbed wire, and the floor is covered in thumbtacks, glass panes, and sometimes even more industrial tools. It is a space where the line between performance art and self-destructive trauma is not just blurred, it is frequently jumped over with a front flip.
It is a heavy topic, and Daniel was asking a really pointed question. He wanted to know about the reality of the props. Can you actually gimmick something as volatile as glass? And more importantly, how on earth does a human body sustain that kind of trauma and just keep going? It feels like we're looking at a modern version of the Roman Colosseum, but with neon tubes and weed whackers instead of lions and tridents. Daniel actually said he thinks this should be banned. He finds it morally indefensible. So today, we are going to look at the physics, the physiology, and the ethics of the deathmatch.
It is a fascinating, if somewhat gruesome, intersection of physics, physiology, and ethics. And Daniel's point about banning it is one we should definitely tackle later on. But before we get to the morality of it, I think we have to establish what is actually happening in that ring. Because there is a massive misconception that because it is wrestling, it is all fake. In the deathmatch world, the word fake is a very dangerous oversimplification. We need to define our terms. You have gimmicked stunts, which use things like sugar glass or dulled wire, and then you have hardcore or deathmatch spots, which use actual industrial-grade materials. The evolution of this niche spectacle is wild. It started in Japan in the late 80s and early 90s with promotions like Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, or FMW, where they pioneered the exploding barbed wire deathmatch. It migrated to the United States through ECW and later evolved into the hyper-violent styles we see today in promotions like CZW or GCW.
Right. We always hear that wrestling is scripted, which it is. The outcomes are predetermined. But you cannot script the way a piece of glass interacts with skin. You cannot tell a light tube to break in a way that does not create 1,000 tiny razors. So, Herman, let's start with the hardware. Daniel asked if you can gimmick glass. When we see a wrestler go through a giant pane of glass in the middle of the ring, what are we actually looking at? Is there a safe way to do that?
That is the big question. In Hollywood, if you see a character jump through a window, they are usually using what we call sugar glass. It is actually a resin, often made from something like isomalt, which is a sugar substitute. It looks like glass. It sounds like glass when it breaks, but it is incredibly brittle and the edges are nowhere near as sharp as silica-based glass. But here is the catch, and it is a big one. Sugar glass is not actually harmless. Even in high-budget films, performers can get severe eye injuries or deep puncture wounds if a shard hits at the wrong angle. It is safer, but not safe. Furthermore, sugar glass is incredibly expensive and very fragile. It melts in high humidity and breaks if you breathe on it too hard. For a small wrestling promotion running out of a high school gym or a fairground, buying a 4-foot by 6-foot sheet of sugar glass for several $100s just to break it in 10 seconds is not economically viable.
So, what do they use instead? Are they just heading to the local hardware store and buying standard window panes? Because that seems like a recipe for a literal crime scene.
Often, yes, but there are ways they try to mitigate the danger, though mitigate is a very relative term here. One thing they use is tempered glass, which is what your car windows are made of. When tempered glass breaks, it shatters into small, relatively dull cubes rather than long, jagged shards. This is due to the internal stresses created during the cooling process. It is still heavy, and getting hit with 100 pounds of glass cubes still hurts. It is like being hit with a bucket of gravel, but the risk of a deep arterial laceration is lower. However, even tempered glass is pricey. The most common thing you see in the truly gritty death matches is annealed glass, or standard plate glass. This is the stuff that breaks into those long, sword-like spears.
That is terrifying. I have seen clips where they literally lean a pane of that glass against a chair, and one guy powerbombs another guy through it. If that is real plate glass, how are they not leaving the arena in an ambulance every single time?
Well, sometimes they are, but there is a bit of a trick to it. They will often score the glass beforehand. They take a glass cutter and create invisible lines of stress in the pane, often in a diamond or starburst pattern. This encourages the glass to break along those specific lines into smaller pieces rather than large, unpredictable shards. It does not make the glass less sharp, but it makes the failure of the material more predictable. It is a way of managing the chaos. But even then, you are still dealing with a material that is harder than human bone and sharper than a scalpel. The physics of the break matter too. If the wrestler hits the glass with a high velocity and spreads their weight across a large surface area, the glass shatters outward. If they hit it with a bony prominence like an elbow or a tailbone, the glass is more likely to pierce rather than shatter.
And then there are the light tubes. Those seem to be the staple of the genre. You see wrestlers hit each other with bundles of 10 or 20 fluorescent tubes at a time. It creates this huge cloud of white dust and a massive sound. What is the deal with those? Are they less dangerous than window glass?
In some ways, yes, because the glass is very thin. It does not have the mass of a window pane, so it does not penetrate as deeply into the muscle tissue. But light tubes bring a whole different set of medical problems. That white dust people see? That is not just for show. That is a phosphor coating on the inside of the tube. And inside that tube, there is a small amount of mercury vapor.
Wait, mercury? As in the heavy metal that causes neurological damage? We are talking about people intentionally breaking mercury-filled tubes in a crowded room?
When those tubes break, that mercury vapor is released into the immediate vicinity. The wrestlers, the referee, and the fans in the front row are all inhaling trace amounts of mercury. Not to mention the phosphor dust itself, which is a major respiratory irritant. If you get that dust into a deep cut, it can cause complications with healing and even lead to granulomas, which are small areas of inflammation. It is a toxicological nightmare disguised as a visual effect. Each tube contains about 5 milligrams of mercury. If you break 100 tubes in a match, you are looking at half a gram of mercury vapor in an unventilated high school gym. That is not just a risk to the wrestlers, it is a public health hazard.
This reminds me of our discussion back in episode 878 about human resilience. We talked about how the body can endure incredible stress, but this feels like it is pushing into a different category. It is not just blunt force trauma, it is systematic laceration. When a wrestler gets covered in these hundreds of tiny cuts, what is the physiological response? How do they not just go into shock from the pain alone?
Moving from the physics of the props to the biology of the body, it is a fascinating cocktail of neurochemistry. When the body is subjected to that kind of immediate high-intensity trauma, the sympathetic nervous system kicks into overdrive. We are talking about a massive dump of adrenaline and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. These chemicals do a few things. First, they induce a state of stress-induced analgesia. Basically, your brain deprioritizes pain signals because it thinks you are in a life or death fight. The pain is still there, but it is muffled, moved to the background. This is part of the HPA axis response, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which manages your body's reaction to stress.
I have heard wrestlers describe it as a warm sensation rather than a sharp one during the match. They say they do not really feel the cuts until they get to the back and the adrenaline wears off. It is like the body is putting up a temporary shield.
That is exactly right, but there is another layer to it. The body also releases endogenous opioids like endorphins and enkephalins. It is the same thing that causes a runner's high, but cranked up to 11. This chemical shield is what allows them to keep moving. However, the real danger is not just the pain, it is the blood loss and the risk of infection. If you have ever seen a deathmatch wrestler after a 20-minute bout, they are often what is called a crimson mask. They are covered in blood from head to toe. This happens because the scalp and the back have a high density of capillary beds. Even a shallow cut in these areas will bleed profusely, making the injury look much worse than it might be internally. It is a work, in the sense that it looks more lethal than it is, but the blood loss is very real.
And that brings up the medical management of these events. I assume these guys are not all going to the emergency room every Saturday night. How do they handle the aftermath? If you have 50 small cuts on your back, you cannot exactly put a band-aid on all of them.
This is where it gets really underground. Most of these wrestlers have become experts in what I would call battlefield medicine. They use a lot of cyanoacrylate, which most of us know as superglue. It was actually used in the Vietnam War to quickly close wounds in the field. They will get in the back, wash the wounds with rubbing alcohol, which by the way is excruciating once the adrenaline dips, and then literally glue their skin back together. They also use a lot of duct tape and athletic tape to hold things in place. It is a very raw, very dangerous way to manage trauma.
That sounds incredibly primitive. It actually makes me think of episode 546, where we asked if today's medicine will look barbaric in 80 years. In this case, we do not even have to wait 80 years. It looks barbaric right now. Is there any actual medical oversight at these shows? Or is it just a guy with a bottle of crazy glue?
It varies wildly. The higher-end independent shows will have certified EMTs or even a doctor backstage, but the smaller shows might just have a guy with a first aid kit who knows how to use a staple gun. And yes, they do use surgical staples, often without anesthesia, to close deeper gashes. The long-term medical cost is significant. We are talking about permanent nerve damage, massive scar tissue buildup, which wrestlers call the map of their career, and the constant risk of bloodborne pathogens like hepatitis C. When you have two people bleeding profusely in a ring covered in shared weapons, the risk of cross-contamination is astronomical. Even if the wrestlers are tested, the environment itself is not sterile.
While the physics explain the how, the ethics force us to ask the why. It is a strange form of bodily autonomy. These athletes are choosing this. They know the risks, or at least they think they do. But Daniel's prompt touched on a really difficult question. He said he thinks this should be banned. He asked if we should or even can rationally ban the desire for self-destruction. As someone who tends to lean toward individual liberty and personal responsibility, I find that a tough one. If two consenting adults want to hit each other with light tubes in a barn for $100, does the state have a right to stop them?
That is the core of the libertarian debate, isn't it? If we say people have the right to do what they want with their own bodies, where do we draw the line? We allow people to climb Mount Everest, which has a significant death rate. We allow people to box and compete in mixed martial arts, which we know causes long-term brain trauma. Deathmatch wrestling is just a more visually jarring version of that risk, but I think the reason people want to ban it is the aesthetic. It looks like torture. It looks like something that violates the basic dignity of the human form. There is a philosophical argument that some things are so degrading to the human spirit that a civilized society cannot permit them even with consent.
Right. And there is a difference between a sport where the goal is to win a contest and the injury is a byproduct, versus a performance where the injury is the point. In a deathmatch, the audience is not just cheering for a 3-count pinfall. They are cheering for the spot where someone gets a weed whacker to the stomach. It turns the trauma into the product. And from a conservative standpoint, you could argue that this degrades the culture. It desensitizes the audience to violence in a way that is fundamentally different from a choreographed movie. In a movie, we know the blood is corn syrup. In a deathmatch, we know it is real. That knowledge changes the relationship between the performer and the observer.
That is a strong point. But there is also the practical side of banning things. If you ban deathmatch wrestling, does it go away, or does it just move to even less regulated spaces? Right now, at least some of these shows have insurance, they have some medical staff, and they have at least a baseline of peer-reviewed safety standards. If you push it entirely underground, you lose all of that. You end up with teenagers in backyards doing even more dangerous things with zero oversight. We saw this in the early 2000s with the backyard wrestling craze. It was much more dangerous than the professional deathmatch scene because there was no work involved. It was just pure, uneducated carnage.
So maybe the answer is not a ban, but better regulation. But then you run into the problem of the promoters. If you regulate it to the point where they need a full trauma team and expensive sugar glass, the business model collapses. These shows only exist because they are cheap and dangerous. It is a niche market that thrives on its own marginalization.
The fans feel like they are part of a secret club that can handle the real stuff, and the wrestlers often feel a sense of pride in their toughness. There is a psychological element here that we should not ignore. For many of these performers, they might not have the traditional athletic background for the major leagues. The death match gives them a path to notoriety and respect within a specific community. It is a high-cost entry fee, but for them, the adulation of that small crowd is worth the scars. But we have to talk about the survivorship bias. We see the guys who have been doing this for 10 years, but we do not see the 19-year-old who severed a tendon in his first match and can no longer use his left hand.
I want to go back to the physics for a second because I am still hung up on the how of it all. You mentioned the light tubes and the window panes. What about the barbed wire? I have seen matches where the entire ring ropes are replaced with barbed wire. Is that stuff gimmicked, or is it the same stuff a farmer uses to keep cattle in a field?
It is usually real barbed wire, but they do something called debarbing for certain spots. They will take a pair of pliers and snip off the actual points or dull them down in the areas where they know a wrestler's face or neck is going to make contact. But for the rest of it, it is the real deal. The danger with barbed wire isn't just a cut, it is what we call an avulsion. The barbs are designed to hook into a surface and stay there. If a wrestler moves too quickly while hooked, the wire doesn't just slice the skin, it tears a chunk of it away. That is why you see those jagged, uneven scars on deathmatch veterans. The tensile strength of industrial barbed wire is significantly higher than the gimmicked versions used in standard wrestling promotions, leading to those deep tissue injuries.
It is a wonder they don't get tetanus every other week.
Well, most professional wrestlers are actually very diligent about their vaccinations. You have to be. But the real medical miracle is the human skin itself. It is incredibly elastic and resilient. While it seems like they are being shredded, most of those light tube cuts are superficial. They bleed a lot because the scalp and the back have a high density of capillary beds, but they are not life-threatening in the immediate sense. The body's ability to clot is also a factor. In episode 878, we discussed how the body can prioritize clotting in high-stress situations. The fibrinogen in the blood starts working almost immediately to plug those tiny leaks.
So it's a combination of physics, using thin glass and scoring it, and biology, the adrenaline mask and the body's natural repair systems. But let's talk about the long term. We see these guys in their 20s and 30s doing this. What does a 60-year-old retired deathmatch wrestler look like?
To be honest, we don't have a huge sample size, because the genre hasn't been around in its current form for that many decades. But the ones we do see often suffer from chronic pain, limited mobility due to scar tissue, and in some cases the long-term effects of that mercury and phosphor exposure we mentioned. There is also the mental health aspect. If your entire identity is built on being the guy who can take the most pain, what happens when your body finally says no more? There is a high rate of substance abuse in the industry, often starting as a way to manage the pain of these matches. It becomes a cycle of trauma and self-medication.
That is the dark side of the consenting adult argument. Consent is a snapshot in time. You might consent to a light tube match when you are 24 and feel invincible, but you are also consenting to the chronic back pain and nerve damage you will have when you are 50. It is hard for a young person to truly weigh those long-term costs against the immediate payoff of a cheering crowd. We see this in other fields too, but here, the damage is so intentional.
It really is. So, what are the takeaways for our listeners? First, it is crucial to understand the difference between controlled risk and uncontrolled trauma. In a professional setting, even a death match has a level of craft. These performers are trying to give the illusion of nearly dying while staying just on the right side of the line, but that line is incredibly thin. If you are a fan of this, or if you are just curious, you have to look for the medical infrastructure. If you see a show where there are no EMTs, where the ring is a mess of rusty metal, and where there is no clear safety protocol, you are not watching a sport. You are watching a tragedy in slow motion.
That is a great point. Authenticity in these circles is often equated with a lack of safety, which is a dangerous fallacy. A real match isn't one where someone gets a permanent injury. It is one where the performers are skilled enough to make you think they did while actually being able to walk away. We should also be critical of the viral stunts we see. Just because a clip has 10 million views doesn't mean the person in it is a professional. Often, the most viral clips are the ones where something went horribly wrong because the performers were untrained.
And I think we should also be aware of our own role as the audience. There is an old saying in wrestling that the fans are the bloodthirsty marks. The promoters are just giving them what they want. If the fans stopped showing up for the glass in the wire, the wrestlers would stop doing it. It is a feedback loop. As we get more desensitized to violence through movies and video games, the real version has to get even more extreme to break through the noise. It is an arms race of shock value. We went from hardcore wrestling in the 90s, which was mostly chairs and tables, to death matches today, which involve fire, glass, and power tools.
Where does it go next? That is the question that haunts me. If we are already at weed whackers and light tubes, the next step is essentially just gladiatorial combat. Will VR or AI-enhanced stunts eventually replace the need for physical blood? We are already seeing digital effects that are indistinguishable from reality. Maybe in 10 years we can get the same shock without anyone actually needing to inhale mercury vapor.
I hope so, but there is a segment of the audience that will always crave the real thing. They want to know that the person in front of them is actually suffering. It is a dark part of the human condition, the desire to witness the breaking point. Whether it is a high-wire act without a net or a death match, the danger is the draw. Our fascination with this trauma is a reflection of our own desensitization and our desperate need to feel something visceral in an increasingly digital world.
Well, this has been a much deeper dive into a very sharp topic than I expected. I think it is important to remember that behind the blood and the broken glass, these are human beings with families and lives. They are not just props in a show. Daniel, I hope this helped answer some of your questions about the how and the why, even if it didn't make the reality any less squeamish.
Well said, Corn. And if you have been following along with us for a while, you know we love these kinds of deep dives into the weird and the uncomfortable. If you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us and keeps the show growing.
It really does. We've been doing this for over 1,000 episodes now, and the community feedback is what keeps us going. You can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today, like episode 878 on resilience and episode 546 on the future of medicine, at our website, myweirdprompts.com.
And a big thanks to Daniel for sending this one in. It definitely gave us a lot to chew on, even if it did make me a bit nervous about the next time I have to change a light bulb.
Same here. I think I will stick to my sloth-like pace of life and leave the light tubes to the professionals.
Good call. All right, this has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening. We will catch you next time.
Until then, stay curious and stay safe. Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth